All right, we are at week number 2 of our Bible reading in September, working through the prophets this year and finally focused on the Messiah in the kingdom of God, which we said last week, it really brings us to more familiar territory because typically if we are in the Old Testament prophets at all, it's typically to find the hints about the Messiah.
Right. And even if we didn't realize it, some of the words that we're familiar with from the New Testament were
Link
actually
back
the
to the Old,
apostles
yeah.
quoting some of these very passages and saying, this is what's going on in the preaching of the gospel and the growth of the church.
So Micah 4 is what we're going to be reading this week, the beginning of that chapter, and it's familiar language, but maybe not because of Micah 4.
Yeah. Ironically, Isaiah says essentially the same thing in
Maybe
Isaiah
where
chapter
we've
2.
seen it before.
Yeah, but we wanted to give Micah a shout out today, so we're there.
So let's take a look at Micah 4. We're going to be reading the first 5 verses there is what you've assigned. But verse 1 opens with a very familiar phrase when you're thinking about Old Testament messianic prophecy, and that is, it will come about in the last days. And so one of the cue phrases that may well indicate you're about to read something about the coming Messiah, about Jesus, is that phrase, the last days.
Yeah. If you see, and that's one of those, again, we talked about themes this year, kind of, try to give some tools to read the prophets more profitably on your own. And so, this is one of those phrases that, I don't know, I'm just, picking a number, but 9 times out of 10 or something, but the majority of the time you see a phrase like in the last days, in the latter days, in that day, something like that. It's going to a messianic key, and it's talking about some aspect of the work of the Messiah, either the first, second coming,
or that time period.
And by the way, that helps you make sense of like when Paul says, in one of his letters to Timothy, in the last days will come. He wasn't talking chronologically. He's talking in the same way that the prophets were talking. In this messianic period, this is how things are going to be.
Yeah, and that's actually been one of the purpose in trying to identify all of these themes this year, even if you don't understand all the details of what's said by the prophet, at least you kind of know what he's talking about, and where he's going.
That's right.
And so that's true of this theme as well. We want to just try to know when, okay, maybe this is where he's going to be saying some things about Jesus. Let's see if I can pick up some things about that. Verse 2 also has, I think, a key phrase in it when he says many nations are going to come into this house of the Lord that is going to be built. And that, too, I think has significance that we really need to pay attention to.
Right. No, that's exactly right, because part of what's being shown there or said there is that, part of what the end result in the latter days of the messianic work is going to be is it's not just going to be a strictly Jewish restoration or a strictly Jewish kingdom. That, going back all the way back to, again, you remember covenantal thinking to the promise to Abraham, in you all nations will be blessed. That when the Messiah does his work in these latter days, not just Jews, but all nations, Jew and Gentile, will come together to worship the Lord. And of course, part of what's great is, especially when you put that phrase back into the whole little context there that we're reading, in the latter days, the mountain of the house of the Lord, that's the temple, will be established as the highest of mountains, be lifted above the hills. The people shall flow into it. Many nations shall come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his way. So there's a teaching, not just a pure worship. You're going to learn the ways of God.
Well, I marked those 2 words, too, in verse number 2, that he may teach and that we may walk. Because notice all the way back in the prophecies, this emphasis on sitting at the feet of Jesus, learning, and then doing what he says, being obedient, has been part of this plan for the kingdom of God from the beginning.
Right, that's right. But even then, for out of Zion shall go forth the law, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And again, that's part of, when you pick up the New Testament, that's exactly what they're trying to say. Hey, this happened. Because especially on the day of Pentecost, when you go back and you read Acts 2 and you look at the details that were given, we got to remember the Bible is very sparse on details when you stop and think about storytelling. And so when details are given, they're there for a reason. Why are we told on the day of Pentecost? Luke wants us to know, the Spirit wants us to know that people were gathered from all nations. And yes, they were probably Jewish, dispersed people, and languages, that's why the great miracle on the day of Pentecost was everybody hearing in their own language.
Right.
Because the nations had gathered to the mountain of the house of the Lord, and the law of God, the new covenant, was going forth from literal Jerusalem on that day as the apostles proclaim the raising of Jesus from the dead, the forgiveness of sins through baptism, and the new gospel, the new covenant that God has put forth. And so literally, and Micah saying in the latter days, but that's part of why Paul can still say we're living in these latter last days. This has all begun. This has started. Literally on the day of Pentecost, this is what happened in Jerusalem.
The reversal of Babel.
The reversal of Babel, where, again, people were now able to hear, in a sense, one language, so to speak. The miracle of everybody hearing as Peter preached. Because which were the nations began. We forget that. What was the beginning of the nations? Genesis 10:11 teaches it was the beginning. We focus on nations today more racially. The real beginning in the Bible was
languages.
The division of languages, and then everything else flowed out from that over the centuries and millennia. But the scattering. So again, God is, and you think about what Paul says in Galatians, some of what Acts is, even some of Paul's preaching is reported in Acts. God is gathering the nations back together into one people. Not on the basis of DNA biology, but the spiritual people of being recreated as a spiritual seed of Abraham. And again, Abrahamic covenant being ultimately fulfilled as all nations are blessed by being recreated in the new nation.
I knew you would enjoy going back to Genesis.
Oh, always, man. It always goes
totally
back.
baited you with that
Well
one.
done.
Let's comment on verse 3, because I think it gets a lot of attention in pop religion today. This idea of hammering the swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, and nation's not going to lift up sword against nation and all of that. We hear that phrase a lot today.
Yeah. So this is not a replacement for this worldly politics. It starts in verse 3 with, he shall judge between the peoples and settle disputes for strong nations. Go back to last week's reading. The government will be upon his shoulders. Right. Only when the Messiah, and ultimately, I think, ultimately here, this is the end result. We call this the second coming, because remember we talked about, I think in the past, the prophets kind of blur and see the messianic work in its global totality. So at the day of judgment, when every knee bow, every tongue confesses, all kings are dethroned, and global politics end. When at the second coming, when he judges and settles all disputes, just says who is right and who's wrong, who's going to heaven, who's going to hell, because who's lived in sin, who's pursued righteousness under the covenant of Christ. When all of that finally happens, then there will be no war, then there will be peace, because the ultimate fulfillment, what we just typically summarize as heaven comes to pass. And so there'll be no more need for weaponry. There'll be no more need for this. This is not something that's going to happen in this age, because the church has been established. This is in the end when he settles all disputes at the day of judgment. Sin and evil is done away with, and because sin and evil have been dealt with, and the people who commit these things have been driven away and cast into hell forever, you will only, you won't need weapons anymore. This is not a this worldly political program. This is the completion of the messianic work when the amnesty of the gospel era, the preaching of the gospel under the sun is over. He comes back to judge, and he will end all the violence of the world. This is not something that we in our foolishness and our fallenness are going to bring about.
Not at this time.
Not at this time.
Not at this time. So that's our reading in Micah as we continue to think about the Messiah and what he will bring and his times. Remember, we're also reading in Joel this month, so we would encourage you about both of those readings. I should have mentioned this last month. I didn't, or last week. Remember, love to have you guys pass on your questions to us.
Yeah.
It is a 5 Sunday month, which means we'll get an extra week. So you got questions, really, if you got questions about anything related to the prophets, but especially from the Messianic readings and from Joel, if you want to pass those on to us, we'll be happy to work those into the podcast. But in the meantime, keep making your way through these wonderful Messianic promises as we look at the prophets telling us about the coming of Jesus.